This is the third session of the Congress with the title of Diaspora, and we have really 3, not 4 papers. I think that anyway we have a very interesting session with different kind of approach, comparative approach, cultural approach, and social, I imagine, approach, and the constructing approach. The first paper is it's a collective paper from Manuela Palacios. She's there. That is senior lecturer of Spanish literature at the University of Santiago de Compostela. And the other participants are Maria Jesus Nogueira, that is a senior lecturer of Galician literature at the University of Santiago de Compostela, Margarita Esteves Sá, that is senior lecturer of English and American literature, also at the University of Santiago de Compostela, and Maria Jesus Lorenzo Modia, that is full professor of English literature at the University of La Coruña, where she is also Dean of the Faculty of Philology. And the title of the papers is Parallels between Contemporary Galician and Irish Migrant Diasporas.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. So I am the coordinator of a research project funded by the Spanish Ministry of Economy and Competitiveness on the literary relations between Galicia and Ireland. And lately we have focused on the discourses on women's mobility in Irish and Galician literature. We have been working on this comparative approach between Galicia and Ireland since 2006, and we have produced a number of anthologies and also books of essays, collections of essays. However, today I would like to focus on these 2 books. One is Letras Nómades, published in Berlin, Frankantime, edited by Ana Acuña, who is here among the audience. And this book is about experiences of female mobility in Galician literature. And the second book, a result of our research project that I would like to focus on as well, is the book Existere, also on women's mobility in contemporary Irish, Welsh, and Galician literatures, edited by Maria Jesus Lorenzo Modia. So for this paper today, given the focus of the conference, I'll talk about Galician and Irish women's migrations in our research. In these 2 books, we have gathered the corpus of personal documents, memoirs, and photographs. And Irish and Galician authors, male and female, write accounts and comment on photographs of emigrant women and their families. We have noticed in the writers' collaboration that there's an urgency to tell, as Halbachs also mentioned in his book Les cadres sociaux de la mémoire. The contributing writers in these 2 books, the Irish and Galician writers, are the following ones. I'm not going to give all the names. You might see an imbalance between Galician and Irish writers, but it's because one of the books focused exclusively on Galician literature, and the second book, Existere, focused on Galician, Irish, and Welsh literature as well. The objectives of our research project are, and the reason why I invited these writers to participate, was to stimulate the production of discourses on women's migrations and also to study the role of women in migration flows, rescuing their stories and disseminating them in the public sphere, because these are stories that very often circulate only in the private sphere of the home and the family. Also, the objectives are to analyze the conditions that favor, force, or hinder women's mobility. As well, we wanted to, the project is almost over, to assess the sociological value of narrative accounts of migration, and also photographs. I will be telling you about the photographs as well, as registers of personal, individual, but also collective experience. The methodology that we are indebted to, of course, since we are literary scholars, we are indebted to literary studies and the analysis, for instance, of narrative devices in memoirs, but also we are indebted to feminist scholarship, because feminism has drawn our attention to the gendered nature of discourses on migration. We have also used trauma studies. We have tried to identify the psychic wounds in discourse. I will tell you about this later. Of course, migration studies from the various social sciences have provided very important data to us as well. And we have also approached the analysis of photography, because many writers, whenever they started to write about migrant women in their families, wrote about a photograph they had. So we thought it was a good idea to invite the writers also to provide that photograph and to comment on that. Now, photography raises interesting questions, as we'll see, regarding the grammar and the ethics of vision. Also, we, as you can see, we have a comparative approach to migration. Migration scholars say that you cannot give a proper account of migration from one single perspective, from one single field. So we combine the literary and the visual arts studies. That's the reason for the photo, but also the graphs. And we have this transnational intercultural approach by comparing Galicia and Ireland. We do not mean to stress the similarities between Galicia and Ireland. We actually want to pay attention to the historical, cultural, economic specificities of each community, but we think that the discourses produced in one community are relevant to the other community. That's the idea. We work with personal documents, photos, letters, memoirs, and we use, of course, a qualitative method, case studies and life narratives for this type of work in particular. Feminism drew our attention to the fact that even though in the 20th century there were more women migrants than men, there was very scarce attention to women's migration before the 1980s. And you know the very famous article by Morok Vasek saying that women also migrate in 1984. Also, as late as the 1990s, Donna Gabakia was saying that actually it was sociology that had paid attention to women's migrations rather than history studies. The first book-length study of women's migrations in Ireland was in 2004 by Breda Gray, a sociologist. In Galicia, we had, of course, the studies by Hernández Borge in 2008. I'm now here I have the reference to the book by Liñares Giraud, 2009, and they refer to Spanish migration, but their books contain chapters on specifically female Galician women migrants. So this is interesting. But as late as 2008, 2009, as you can see. A Galician historian. She works at the Faculty of Economics. She wrote in 2009 that very often women's migrations are studied under the category of family migration, and they are seen as simply following their husbands. But therefore, there's little known, we don't know enough at least, about their role, women's role in the labor force in the destination country. In Ireland, in 2012, Mary Muldowney was saying that history studies in Ireland only focused on political and ecclesiastical reactions to female migration, but did not pay attention to the flow of women's migration itself. Regarding trauma studies, Pamela Sharp mentioned that we need to explain or at least analyze the emotional impact of migrations as well. And the founder of trauma studies as applied to literary studies, Geoffrey Hartman, in 2003, encouraged literary critics also to identify the psychic wounds in the narration of trauma. Also, it's interesting, we have seen an interesting use of scriptotherapy, that is writing as a cure, writing about that experience as a cure. And Laura S. Brown also said that we normally think of trauma as a war, a Holocaust, etc. But she said that when we analyze women's migrations, we should shift also the focus to the daily, ordinary trauma, which she says is the expression of dominant institutions. So in the analysis of the writer's accounts of female relatives who migrated, we found that these psychic wounds, for instance, in the expressions of pathos, in the expression of guilt, in the heteroglossia, the use of different languages or different registers, in the expression of confusion, not remembering, not knowing, the gaps, the enigmas, the taboos, all that. Also the expression of anger, as opposed to this emotional expression, we could see and identify other accounts by other writers who opted for impersonality, expressing or telling about those migrant women's experiences in a rather impersonal way, as if they were simply giving us a number of facts. And another interesting choice was that of metafiction, occasionally referring to that experience of a grandmother or a great-grandmother as if it were a folk tale. Right, also I invited male writers to write about women migrants as well. And for this, we found it interesting to refer to Roland Barthes and his very famous book, Le Discours Amoureux, and also his analysis of the beloved body when you contemplate a photograph. And this emotional charge is very interesting as well. Now, what I'm going to say about Susan Sontag and her very famous book on photography is also applicable to the narratives, to the written accounts by the writers. She said that photography introduced a new grammar and ethics of vision. That is, what is worth observing and what are we entitled to observe? Also, she called our attention to the ethical dimension, that is raising consciousness about a historical situation. And of course, about the truth-art dichotomy, because the documents, the photographs, the narratives provide historical evidence to some extent, but they are mediated by ideological and aesthetic criteria. Photography and these narrative accounts also have a therapeutic value because they help in the reconstruction of family bonds. And they also invite to speculation and fantasy. One final warning by Susan Sontag is that the true understanding of events starts when we do not accept the appearance of things. Of course, Bourdieu is also very relevant, and his analysis of the social function of the émigré's photograph, which is a message of success very often, and therefore we should not look at those photographs merely looking for individual particularities. There's this social function to convey success. These are simply some of the photographs which I wanted you to see from Irish and Galician writers and their migrant relatives. We paid attention, and we saw how these writers paid attention to the domestic space, the relationship between the domestic space and emigration, also working in the domestic service and how it helped to the assimilation, to the host society, how this assimilation may have meant modernization, or other people prefer to say that rather than modernization, we should use the terms the acquisition of bourgeois regulatory ideals. And of course, the writers write about the effects of migration, the remittances sent home, the visits. Writers also talk about the emotional geographies, the inherited landscapes. Very often these writers have the need to travel and visit the places that their, let's say, former relatives emigrated to. Also, the contrast between appearance and reality is very relevant because most writers question the veracity of their own narrative accounts and also the veracity of the photos. We find recurrent motifs like the sewing machine, women traveling with their sewing machine to America, or the bottle of brandy that they had to give to those people who could be in a position to give them a job in the host country. As the concluding remarks say here, we think that the comparative approach provides new categories of analysis. For instance, what is explicitly mentioned in one community may be silenced in the other, even though it exists. We found this was the case, for instance, with regard to the wet nurses. Galician writers wrote a lot about family members who had worked as wet nurses, whereas the Irish writers won't talk about that, even though we know that there were many Irish wet nurses in the United States. Also, the references to the Catholic Church, which are, let's say, much more critical in Ireland than in Galicia, even though this may sound surprising. And finally, the mutual relevance for Galicia and Ireland of certain elements, such as tropes, to see migration as a natural pattern, and I say natural between quotation marks, in both in Galicia and Ireland, or the use of the term exile, which in Ireland they very often use as a metaphor, or motifs, motifs such as the ones I mentioned, the sewing machine, the bottle of spirits, and also the very frequent references to migration regulations. In the case of women, their pregnancies, how they had to hide their pregnancies, and also the children left behind in the homeland. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for this interesting contribution. And now the next presentation is from Dietmar Osses, Director of the LWL Industrial Museum, Westphalia State Museum of Industrial Heritage and Culture in Bochum. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
The title of the contribution is in the program, but I can mention. It's a nice title, Rise and Fall, but not of the Roman Empire, but of German immigrant communities in the USA, 1848, 1918.
Okay, then I start. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of the conference for the chance to be here this year and give my presentation to you. Our studies about Germans in the States belong to an exhibition project, which was developed by our museum in cooperation with the Westphalian University in Münster and the Institute of German American History of Education. And it was led by my colleague who is director of the Industrial Museum in Lager. But as well as we will have tomorrow another section, especially for museums project, I will only take some examples now from our research, but will not have a closer look on our museums project and exhibition, perhaps next year. For those among us who are not familiar with in our museum and the region of Westphalia, just give me a short look where we are in Europe. Westphalia, right in the center, in the heart of Europe, I think, when you have a look at the map, and the main cities of Westphalia. And this is our museum consisting of 8 sites, building 1 museum. And this is my museum site in Bochum. So thank you, my director, for spending the money for me to coming here. And now let's go in history. Having a closer look on the figures of immigration from Germany to USA, we can find a first peak in the 1950s. Within 1 decade, 1 million Germans left their homeland and went overseas to North America. One of the strongest push factors for leaving Germany was poverty. In Westphalia, like in some other German states, at the end of the 18th century, the population had doubled within 1 generation, but the number of jobs didn't grow as well. Jobs were rarely and badly paid. Due to a special inheritance law, only 1 son of a farmer could inherit the whole property. The other children had to find another job or had to work on the farm without owing it, and that limited the chance to get married and have a family on his own. After some crop failures and the potato blight, like in Ireland in the 1840s, the farmers in the rural regions in Germany suffered hardly from poverty and hunger. Most of the farmers did not have enough land to get sufficient income for themselves and their families. They could not survive with farming alone, and often the whole family had to work as home workers to spin linen, and as you can see on the pictures. But the mechanization of spinning industry and imports from cotton from America set up an enormous pressure on the prices of textiles and reduced the income of the home working people to a minimum. Facing this hopeless situation, for a lot of people, America appeared now as a promised land of milk and honey. In these years, reports from America in newspapers and journals, handbooks and travel guides were quite popular, and a lot of adventure stories were told about the country. And even those who could not afford newspapers or books were extremely impressed by the reports from overseas. Told from mouth to mouth, these stories became more and more colorful. And imports of high-quality cotton and cheap wheat from America to Westphalia appear to be a proof you could hold in your hands, a proof of the power of America. This convinced the people that America was really a blessed country, and letters from German immigrants to the relatives at home drew a picture of America as a land without limits. They became the most popular information media about the USA in Germany those times. In this situation, thousands of poor farmers from Westphalia decided to spend their last money for a ship's trip to the US. People trusted in the positive news from their relatives and friends, which were sent as letters from America. And a lot of them decided to find a better life in America too now. As a consequence, immigration from Westphalia developed to a kind of chain migration. In some small villages, more than 1/3 of the population decided to immigrate to the USA, and most of them choose the same destination. A lot of the farmers from Westphalia went to the Midwest of the United States, especially to Wisconsin. The landscape and the climate there was quite similar to Westphalia, so very quickly the German immigrants felt being at home. They easily could use their methods of farming and became successful farmers in a short period of time. In opposite to Westphalia, in Wisconsin, the land was very cheap and easily to get, but most of the land had to be prepared by the settlers themselves for farming, and not every immigrant could cope with these difficulties. In Wisconsin, Germans settled in the neighborhood to other Germans, and so they established regions of German settlement. As you can see on the map, the blue sectors are farms owned by German immigrants. Most of the farmers were former neighbors or relatives. Facing problems, they often helped each other and stuck together in close communities. This process was even powered and driven by the Protestant faith of the settlers. In the White Lands, in the middle of nowhere, churches developed as centers not only for religious life, but for the social life of the German communities. They became meeting points where all of the settlers from the widespread farms came together. The settlers elected prayers from their community and spent money on building the church and schools. These became the core of the immigrants' social life and communities in the countries. A good example for a farmer who became a prayer is Hermann August Mühlheimer, who was born in a small village in East Westphalia and emigrated to Wisconsin in 1847 as a 19-year-old son of a farmer. After being educated as a prayer by German settlers in Wisconsin, he started to work as prayer himself at the Science Church in the village of Schalbogen. Mühlheimer saw the huge impact of religion on the immigrant's life, and he decided to build up a mission house to educate prayers himself in 1862. The mission house grew rapidly, and students not only were educated in religion, but also in other faculties. And this was a typical step for a German community to build up their own institutions and schools. So, as you know, I come from the Ruhr, the former industrial region in Westphalia, and I must state, in the 1850s, going to America was only one option to leave home in search of happiness and success. Another one was to go to the upcoming industries in the Ruhr, in close neighborhood to Westphalian rural areas. The Ruhr, with its dozens of new opened coal mines and ironworks, can be seen at the Wild West in Germany in those days. Entrepreneurs as well as workers had the chance to make big money in these years in the Ruhr, a region which developed from a rural country to industrial hotspot in the 1850s and 60s. Going to the Ruhr promised good money for hard work and make it possible to return to home and relatives within a one-day's trip. Immigration to America was quite risky, and it was a trip of no return to Europe. But it offered the chance to work as a farmer on its own property, as well as being free from restrictions. America, as a land of freedom and democracy, was an important pull factor for the immigration into the United States. In the middle of the 19th century, Germany was not a unique country, as you know, but more a patchwork of dozens of kingdoms and earldoms. Religion was still depending on the faith of the emperor in some regions, and for farmers, workers, and even for the bourgeois, there was no equal rights. The ideas of freedom and equality was discussed in newspapers, journals, and private circles and of the educated middle class. And in 1848, the ignition of revolution jumped over to some German states as Prussia, Rhineland, Westphalia, of course, Baden and Pfalz. The ideals not only attracted the educated middle class and entrepreneurs, but also workers in the upcoming industries. a national assembly came together in the city of Frankfurt, which set up a national constitution. But within 1 year's time, the democratic process was cut down by the old elites who got back their power. Democratic activists were sent to prison and uprisers were beaten down with armed forces. The leaders of the democratic movement had to escape from persecution. Literally, in the last minute, hundreds of them left the country legally and immigrated to the United States. Others managed to escape with false documents and the help of friends. The ex-migration of the new democratic elites meant a big loss to Germany. It was a kind of intellectual brain drain in those days. But for the United States, these immigrants gave important impulses to the development of society and economy. They were called Latin farmers due to their humanistic education and the fact that some of them tried to work as farmers now in America. But most of them still were intellectuals, and they managed to build up newspapers and journals or were successful as entrepreneurs and salesmen. Within a couple of years, they became ethnic leaders and played an important role in politics and society. And this process was driven by the engagement of a lot of democratic activists from Germany in the American Civil War. A good example for one of those called 48ers is Caspar Butz on the left from Hagen in Westphalia. As a leader of the uprising in Westphalia, he left Germany in 1849. Being in the US, he worked as a salesman, editor of the monthly German-American journal, and as a secretary of the High Court in Illinois. And in 1869, he became the treasurer of the city of Chicago. Friedrich Kapp, in the middle, who escaped from Westphalia to exile in America, worked as a lawyer and a correspondent. He became the leading member of the Republican Party and electoral delegate for Abraham Lincoln. In the late 60s, he became the commissioner for immigration in the state of New York. But the history of the German revolutionists in the States is not only history, but also herstory, of course. Let me take Mathilde Franziska Annecke as an example. In Germany, she was an activist for equal rights, and not only for workers, but even for women. After the beating down of the revolution in Germany, she escaped to New York. There she became as well a well-known speaker in the German democratic community, and she developed to one of the leading voices of American movement for women's rights. She founded the Milwaukee Töchter Institute, a kind of high school for young women, and she fought in the National Women's Suffrage Association for the women's right to vote. America offered liberty in religion, politics, and economy to the immigrants. Most of the German immigrants used this liberty and brought their abilities, knowledge, and science, and a special sense maybe of discipline and organization to the new homeland. Especially the 48ers founded lots of newspapers and journals and established several associations for sports, for politics, and social life, as they were used to do it in Germany. Turnen, also gymnastics, played an important role for the German immigrants, elites. The ideal of the Turnerbund, the gymnastic association, was to combine physical and moral education. So the association not only organized sport events, but also debates and lectures in literature, in philosophy, science, and arts. In Indianapolis, a Free Thinker Sunday school was established to facilitate a free democratic education. Other associations were founded for all kinds of political and social life. The associations became meeting points for the German communities in the cities and built up a social and cultural basis for German diaspora. German immigrants also were successful as entrepreneurs. There are dozens of examples, especially for the industries in Chicago, and Germans played an important role in building up the trade unions too. But I think time is short now, and I will go to another example that fits into stereotypes about Germans until today. And I will take the example of German breweries in America. That's for you, Patty. During the years of the Civil War, the brewing industry in America was taken over by German immigrants. Before 1850, 80% of the beer brewed in America was British ale. In the years after the Civil War, beer became a mass product and the production increased from about 3.7 to 59 million gallons. This increase was the effect of the German breweries in the US. Already in 1857, a newspaper article of the St. Louis Republican stated, "Never the German influence has been more beneficial felt than in the introduction of beer in the US." Brewing experts from Germany, especially from Westphalia, had brought the German lager beer to America. New technologies of brewing and cooling made mass production possible. The regions of German settlement, as the states of Wisconsin, Missouri, and Ohio, formed a beer triangle in America. In 1879, the 5 biggest breweries were all owned by German immigrants. As the breweries in the Midwest were extremely depending on export of their beer to the states with more inhabitants, they advertised the German lager beer not longer as a German product, but now as a real national drink. And you can see it on the advertisement there. It's a real national drink and a family drink. That's really interesting. So I would say this is a strategy of integration from the German breweries. We can see at the beginning of the 20th century, the Germans in America were established as a leading community with great importance and influence in social life, in politics, and in economy. They stuck closely to their community and associations, but at the same time, they fought for the typical American ideals as equality or liberty. So being a German and being an American felt to be the same. The second generation of German immigrants could easily combine these two hearts in their breast, so to say. So the story of German immigrants in the US appeared as a story of successful integration. But with the beginning of the First World War, the situation changed dramatically. The extreme nationalistic movement swept over from Europe to immigrant communities in America. As an effect, the German community stuck closer together now. German newspapers and journals sold more copies than ever, and membership in German association increased a lot. You can see this as a process of renationalization of the Germans in the America. But at the same time, the Germans tried to be loyal to both Germany and America too. As a symbol for this, you can take the newspaper of the German community called Spottvogel, perhaps Mockingbird. It shows the German Germania on the left and the American Lady Liberty on the right. The poem in the middle appeals to the immigrant to be Americans of a German kind. But anti-American voices became louder and louder during the years of war in Europe, and the year 1917 marked a turning point. 4 days before America entered the war, the American President Woodrow Wilson stated, "We shall," quotation, "we shall happily still have an opportunity to prove friendship in our daily attitude and actions towards the million of men and women of German birth, and native sympathy to those who live amongst us and share our life. They are, most of them, as true and loyal Americans as if they never had known any other fealty or allegiance. But if there should be disloyalty, it will be dealt with a firm hand of stern repressions." And after Americans' entry into war, repressions became reality. The governments of the states set up several acts to control German communities. German associations had to give their annual reports in English language. Yeah, it's okay. German newspapers and journals had to give abstract of their German articles in English language before printing, or they had to publish them in both languages. All German associations and publications were proved about their loyalty to America. And in some American states, as in Indiana, it was forbidden to use the German language in school. German culture, some years ago seen as an important basis for the social and cultural life in the whole of America, now was suppressed as and seen as a cause of militarism. Facing this huge anti-German movement, most of the Germans declared their loyalty towards America and followed the way of total assimilation and Americanization. German associations and institutions changed their names. So, for instance, the German house in Indianapolis renamed as Athenaeum. Others were simply closed. This is even true for German newspapers and names of German companies. So, in fact, German culture lost its power as being predominant in the States of America. And even after the war, the name of streets, associations, and companies who formerly were German now kept English, also American. The German community took a step backwards in the American society and never became predominant again. The second generation of German Americans had chosen to assimilate themselves to avoid ethnic discrimination. They still played an important role in the American society, but not longer as Germans, but as Americans.
Well, thank you. The last paper is from Paddy Fitzgerald from the Mellon Center for Migration Studies, Ulster American Folk Park, Omagh, Northern Ireland. And the title is Irish and Basque Diaspora, a Comparative Analysis. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. The first thing I want to do, obviously, like Dietmar, is to say a big thank you to Emilia, all of the people here in Santiago and on the committee who've organized the conference, and for the opportunity to come and present and enjoy what is always my favorite conference of the year when I get to come. I must also apologize for the absence of a biographical note. There's an abstract there which bears no relevance to what I'm going to say this afternoon, and the biography missing is a part of the Brexit strategy. Okay, story behind this presentation is that I, in the spring, was invited by Imanol Galdos, who's in the audience today, to come and participate in the University of the Basque Country Summer School, a two-day seminar focused on the issue of diaspora. And what I've tried to do is slice out a piece of that talk, which I think in a rather simple way, so, you know, I realize I'm skimming the surface a little here, is to set out some of the characteristics of Irish migration and Basque migration. But one of the first things I wanted to do was to take a look at the broad shape of the two diasporas. And I think probably the most important factor to map out at the outset in terms of the Irish migration is that Irish migration, certainly from 1800 on, is most closely paralleled with the English-speaking world. More than 99% of Irish migrants after 1800 travelled to English-speaking destinations. The one destination which bucks that trend is Argentina, but relatively small numbers, 30,000, 40,000 Irish migrants travel to Argentina. When we compare that with the patterns, broad geographical patterns for the Basque Country, obviously a much greater migration flow into Latin and Central America. In North America, a strong migration to the West, and also, of course, movement to the Far East, and particularly the Philippines. What one might say as a broad comment is that the Basque diaspora was more dispersed in terms of its overall settlement patterns, whereas the Irish tended to be compounded in certain urban nodes as a broad pattern. There were points of contact. California and the gold rush of 1849, and some of the villages which very rapidly took shape there was one. The Pampas and the Gaucho experience in Argentina was another. And interestingly, there are these small kind of micro interconnections. We held a conference in June where Professor Nina Ray from Boise, home of the Basques in North America, talked about the first building in Boise, which was erected, that's it, preserved there, by a migrant called O'Farrell from County Tyrone, which is where the conference was in my home county in Ireland. So there are these small interconnections. So, as I said, the broad methodology is comment on the left-hand side of the screen related to Ireland and parallel comment where I can in relation to the Basques. One of the features of Irish migration, I think, which stands out in the broad comparative European frame is that of persistence. From the 14th of September 1607, and this iconic event, the Flight of the Earls, by which about 100 of the Gaelic nobility migrated, destined for Spain, end up in Rome. But that iconic event really points to the large-scale migration of the Irish, Gaelic and Catholic nobility from about 1600 through to the middle part of the 18th century. And they invested a lot of time and energy in establishing their lineage, their pedigree as a nobility. And that, of course, was crucial in terms of accessing patronage networks across not only France and Spain, but out into the Spanish and French empires. Again, Morales' book of 2010 pinpoints this clearly. In some senses, there are parallels with the Basques. Of course, the elaborate series of foral laws known as the fueros underpinned this Basque sense of universal nobility. And that, at the same time, one can see creating the grounds for access, particular and special access to Spanish imperial endeavors as maritime adventurers, clerics, administrators, and merchants. So again, there I think is scope for further research on a comparative frame to explore the mechanisms by which patronage was exploited. In a much more modern frame, we can look at the position post 2007-8. What we see is the end of the Celtic Tiger economy and the return of very heavy emigration from particularly the Republic of Ireland. Interestingly, aim more at Australia and Canada than the old heartlands of Britain and the US. The parallel in the Basque Country, I would argue, is a much more robust economic performance, which permits the idea of Bilbao as boomtown, permitting, as we saw earlier, more limited outward migration. And talk about motif, which Manuela was talking about earlier, there is no doubt that the dominant motif for all Irish migration is the Great Famine of 1845 to 50-51. This idea, this concept, this motif marks all Irish emigration as being essentially exilic. So that has this huge impact right across the globe in terms of the way we think about the Irish diaspora. It is, of course, highly misleading in that about 12% of emigrants who left Ireland from about 1600 to the present emigrated in those 5 years. And many of them, you could argue, were not, in fact, refugees in a classic famine sense. An example of how this works is a very well-known professor in the United States, Kirby Miller, asks his large undergraduate class who do Irish America, 200 of them, at the beginning of the year, when did your people, if you're of Irish extraction, when did your people come here? And they all, 97%, put their hands up and say, oh, 1847. And he then informs them that the vast majority of them are wrong. Most of their antecedents came in the decades after the famine, not during the famine. And of course, the famine then plays out into the political discourses of contemporary republicanism and memorialization of Irish emigration. Is there a parallel with the Basque Country? You could point to the end of the First Carlist War, 1839-41. Certainly there's a subsistence crisis which plays some part in propelling migration, but not on the scale of the Irish famine. I would argue that if there is a parallel in terms of thinking about the role of an exilic motif, surely it is the after effects of 1939 and the Spanish Civil War as what feeds into the psychology that underpins much thought about exile from the Basque Country itself. Chain migration, already mentioned. Chain migration, of course, is something that marks almost all of the migration from Europe to the New World. But in Ireland, it has, I would argue, a particularly strong dynamic role. The painting here by James Brennan neatly illustrates the role by which correspondence and remittance feeds the migration of younger siblings out to, from a specific place, a locale in Ireland, to a specific place out in diaspora. The example underneath is the island of Arranmore, off the coast of Donegal, and from here, for 3 generations from the middle part of the 18th century, migration to Beaver Island in Lake Michigan continued on very, very strongly, a classic example. If we look at Pescador's book, looking at the Ortsun Valley in the Basque Country, and focusing more on the early modern migration, you might be led to believe a different pattern of pioneers dispersing more widely. Actually, I think much of the evidence would concur that it is actually very similar to Ireland in the centrality of the role of remittance and chain migration in shaping patterns which exploited transnational familial networks. One other interesting comparative feature of Irish migration throughout the later 19th century, early 20th century is the balance between genders. The broad European pattern sees a preponderance of young men migrating. In Ireland, right throughout that half century, the pattern is very even between male and female. This lovely painting by Erskine Nicol, 1864, is in fact a very true reflection of exactly who the emigrants leaving Ireland were. Young, single adults, not yet married, but probably already in the employment market. In other words, more women leave Ireland, and role in domestic service was the #1 big employer for young women, and textiles was another crucial economic role which allowed women to transfer their skills across the ocean. The parallel in the Basque Country is a preponderance of young men emigrating, mostly young males between about 16 and 25. In the New Worlds, both in South America and North America, endogamy was very high. And this, I think, it actually raises an interesting research question, which would be to look at patterns of intermarriage. One could look at, for example, patterns between Irish and Basque marriage in particular, where those occurred. But the other interesting aspect is the extent to which the nature of the predominantly male outflow from the Basque Country may have affected female roles and definitions within the Basque Country itself. One other interesting point about Irish migration in this time frame is that Ireland, with the exception of the European Jews, exhibited the lowest return rate throughout most of the later 19th century, estimated at around 1 in 10, compared with a broad European pattern of about 3 in 10, or a little over 3 in 10, about 35%. Some parts of Europe as high as 80–90%. So in Ireland, as in this, again, Nicol illustration, the option was often rejected of leaving the New World to return to the Old World. The problem in Ireland culturally was return was problematic. If you know the film or the original play by J.B. Keane, The Field, it's interesting that the figure who comes back to buy the field is a returned Yank. That is the problem. In the Basque Country, Indianos, as they were called, returned. Part of the problem is the statistics of working out French Basque and Spanish Basque. The return rates for France are about half that for Spain throughout the later 19th century, 20% in France, 40% in Spain. Does that apply is the interesting question for the Basque lands. What we do see is evidence for their influence in the Basque countries upon return in areas such as building, houses, and also farm technologies, tools, how you work the land. Attached to the idea of low return, I would argue, is what we might refer to as the ritual of departure. Throughout the later 19th century, particularly in rural Western Ireland, there evolved a custom known as the American or living wake. This is based on an Irish wake, which is a funeral custom. People sat up overnight with the body. And this is transferred then. In other words, the emigrant moves to the next world rather than, the new world rather than the next world. And the party convoy the migrant, that is, they walk to a specific point in the landscape at dawn of the morning of their departure. And there is a very emotionally charged parting, where the emigrant party moves on to the port and those return back to the clachan or village. So I think what's interesting in all of this psychologically is it's a very strong emotional affirmation of the need for the migrant not to forget the home place because of remittance, the need to send the money back. My question is, what happens? Is there any form of parallel in terms of departure from Bilbao, or for that matter from Santiago or La Coruña? What are the patterns? Is there anything that parallels this kind of ritual? Not all of the emigration from Ireland by any means was permanent. Significant numbers of seasonal agricultural labourers, or spalpeens in the Irish, are emigrating on an annual basis to Britain. I mean, we are talking by the 1860s of 100,000 emigrants per year, leaving to work on the harvest in mainland Britain, leaving mostly the rural western peripheral areas in order to generate rents by working in Britain and then returning. Now, you'll see my big question mark. What is the pattern here? Well, one thing I think in terms of internal migration that could be raised as a comparative frame worthy of further research is to do with rural-urban migration. 2 points really about this in the Irish context. One is that in the Republic of Ireland, the transition point from rural living to urban living is extraordinarily late. Only in 1962 do a majority of the population of the Republic of Ireland live in an urban context. They're up 3, maybe 4 generations ahead of most of Western Europe. Belfast in Northern Ireland, large city closest to me, is a perfect example of a city which grew very, very rapidly in the late Victorian Edwardian period, that is the end of the 19th, early part of the 20th century, on the basis of rural-urban migration. And that, I think, raises this interesting exploration of a pattern that might fit for Bilbao. What are the similarities and differences between the ways in which Belfast and Bilbao rely on internal migration? But the main point I wanted to make is that for most of those migrants who leave rural Ireland, the transition to urban living occurs, but it doesn't occur in Ireland. It occurs in a transoceanic context. They make the transition to urban living by migrating to America. Inheritance is a key underpinning of the migration from Ireland. I don't know if you can make out the detail in this, but it's just an extract from one small townland in rural Western Ireland. Bully Boy in Leitrim. If you look at 1901, the McMorrow family are listed there as a farming family. 10 years later in 1911, 4 of the siblings have gone. The eldest son inherits primogeniture, takes the farm. The other 4 have to go somewhere. Most strong likelihood is they have emigrated to the New World. And patterns like this, again, the strict inheritance laws which characterized the Basque Country really, again, put an emphasis on the need for younger sons to go, and many of them to work as shepherds in the American West, because there was no land back in the Basque Country. Now, this is a huge topic, an area, probably the one I was meant to talk about, given the title of this conference. Language is central, obviously, and one of the interesting things is that by the age of Ellis Island, i.e. 1892, most Irish immigrants arriving into the New World are literate in English, and this is a significant advantage that I would argue over most other European migrants arriving into the United States. You might think Catholicism was the central badge of identity, but do not forget that a significant proportion of the immigrants, even in the later 19th century, are Protestant, and that their identities may well have been British, as opposed to easily identifiable as Irish and Catholic. The central point, which is something we echoed throughout the entire conference, is about the multiplicity of identities. And Irish Catholics were evident in terms of how they could reflect identities which were heterogeneous. You could be a soldier. The extent of Irish Catholic migration into the British military is huge. Even greater if you look at army wives. 40% of the army wives by the 1830s are Irish and Catholic. So all of that complexity is there to explore. Music and song is, of course, probably going without saying, a central badge of identity formation. And interestingly, a large proportion of songs written about a home place in Ireland are actually written in the New World. My lovely place, the local place in Ireland, it's not written in the local village, it's written in the New World, and it transmits back. Catholicism, of course, in the Basque experience was also central to identity. The Irish never made any claim to culinary distinction. I was just saying to somebody over lunch that I live in an area which could be consigned as a gastronomic desert. So we didn't, as the Irish, make any real notable contribution in that area. But of course, it goes without saying, one of the reasons I was so quick to take up Imanol's offer to go to the San Sebastian was the magnificent food. Not to say that Galicia isn't also magnificent. I'll get into trouble here. The photograph at the bottom is a group of Munster rugby fans in San Sebastian supporting Munster playing Biarritz. And what we see is a word that might be a connector, and it's a difficult one for historical study, and the word is conviviality, that we perhaps enjoy social activities. I see you nodding enthusiastically. Leave that one out there. Okay, final slide, final comment. Just to say, to sort of bring this up to the present, I was interested in the comments Sarah made earlier about the role of information technology. And there's a narrative out there that in some ways information technology lessens pain. It dilutes trauma. I'm not so sure. And I think looking at patterns of migration in 2016 from Ireland, I'd be very conscious of the extent to which, particularly differences within families of generation, grandparents, there was a wonderful quote in the Irish Times recently where a grandmother said, "I can't hug Skype." Which says so much in a simple quotation. But one of the things about Ireland over the last 2-3 generations is this roller coaster. If the economy is good, we can stay, we can work. If it isn't, we have to go. Remember, we were top of the league table there for people living abroad in the previous presentation. What this does is to accentuate a culture of insecurity. Lots of young 20-somethings in Ireland feel deeply insecure because they do not know whether they will be bringing up their children here or in Ireland or in America or Britain or Australia or Canada. So that culture of insecurity. And in the Basque Country, as I said, there is the idea that whilst there is prosperity and growth, there are still senses of a brain drain, which we heard mentioned earlier. And also concerns I sense around birth rate, which are not just, of course, restricted to the Basque Country, but also are there across Iberia, across Europe, in terms of looking at patterns as they emerge into the 21st century. But whatever happens in the 21st century, and that's not my period, demography will be a very big issue. Thank you.
Questions? Well, 2 points, 2 remarks. One about the presentation of Manuela. I think that there are 2 very interesting subjects, but also very problematic from an hermeneutical point of view. The first one is the question of the photography. It's really a strong source for the historian, but it's a problematic source. And I don't know if we have now a method, a good method, as we have for writing source. Then for writing source, we have philology, 2 cycles. About photography, We don't know. There are the invention in the photography. Sorry, there are the problem of date of the photography. I'm interested in a reflection about that. And the second question on your paper, and then I do some observation about the others, is about trauma. This is an interesting concept. Is a problematic concept. The trauma, yes. When? We have the idea of the après-coup and the delay of the trauma, the effect of the trauma from the moment of the experience. No, that puts some temporal problems that I think that could be studied. I want to say the trauma is not in the moment, or could not be in the moment of the immigration, but could be many years ago. There is, I think, another interesting point for your presentation. It's a question only. What about the relation between entrepreneurs and workers, Germans, and between intellectual Germans and common people? For other case, we know well the gap in the case of the intellectuals and the communities. That intellectual that you mentioned, the political that went away after the revolution of 1848. That is one. And the other is the conflict between the so-called ethnic identity and the class identity. The conflict between, and maybe if there are German entrepreneurs and in the same place, worker Germans. No, what is it? And about Paddy, I only could say about the Argentine case something. It's clear that both Irish and Basque immigrants were successful immigrants, but Basque immigrants were very much integrated than Irish immigrants. And this integration also played a role between the difference between Basque, Spanish Basque and French Basque. This is a construction from a Basque point of view, but in Argentina, the Basque French roll more as French because French is more prestigious than Basque. But Basque is more prestigious than Spain. Than the Spain's identity. No, then I think that how that rules in the case of Irish. There are some Irish in England, Irish in the States. Okay.
May I use your microphone? All right, thank you very much. Yes, those are indeed very interesting questions that are very often raised when we talk about our work, and certainly we are not specialists in photography, and but we were very much interested in the fact that so many writers mentioned the photograph that we said, all right, show us the photograph, and many did. And so from a very limited point of view, which is using what we find is useful in Susan Sontag's analysis, which I found extremely useful for and applicable and relevant for our analysis. And Bourdieu, using those two, we could already analyze at least the way writers spoke about the photographs. But as you, yes, that we limited, that's right,
Okay.
that's right. We limited our work to that, but you are right that the analysis of photography of the photographs themselves would entail a different approach as well. Yes, sure. And regarding the trauma, I don't know if that's what you meant, but of course that always reminds me about Freud and the return of the repressed. And that, so in the end, I was really moved by the way writers now write about their mother migrants, the emotional charge, because very often the family broke up. So the emotional charge in their writings is so moving, as I was saying, that I was wondering as well, how long has this writer repressed this emotion, and how it is coming up to the surface every time the traumatized person revisits the trauma. Sometimes it's secure, but sometimes it's, again, opening the wound. So I agree with you. I think this delayed trauma is like the return of the repressed. Yes.
Okay. Yes, it works. To your question about the question of class, workers, entrepreneurs, I think it's more a question of society in the rural areas and in the cities, of course. Okay. And if you see, I skipped the part speaking about the trade unions and workers. Even in Chicago, there were a lot of socialist and communistic activists, even from the revolutionary times in Germany, who now were active in the trade unions and in the workers. And there was a significant issue in the 17th when there were mass demonstrations, and there was, as written in a newspaper journal, the first explosion of a dynamite bomb while a demonstration, and there were sent about 40 people to prison, and they were some were killed by the how to say by the judges for that, and there were a huge percentage of German activists being there. So but as we can see from the history written in America, this was skipped away from the story, and so they concentrate more on the positive German successful story of the Germans who loved the liberty and equality, and the other chains of stories are not kept until yet. So perhaps so far.
Thank you, Fernando, for your comment. And I think you're right. One of the kind of interesting things in terms of the Irish experience in Argentina is that it's quite an interesting demonstration of what I'm saying about the nature of the complexity of the relationship with the British Empire. Because although obviously Argentina wasn't formally any part of the British Empire, the reason you could argue that 30 to 40,000 Irish migrants were there were as part of a colonial trading relationship with Argentina. So within that is a lot of complexity in terms of identity formation and how they interplayed. I mean, right throughout the traditional Irish nationalist narrative of the diaspora has been rather simplistic in terms of presenting the British Empire as the problem, and that there was no interrelationship, and lots of empirical evidence demonstrates it wasn't like that. Lots of Irish migrants traded and interrelated with Protestant migrants from England, Scotland, Wales, right throughout the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. So it shines a light on that complexity. Final point is just to say the interesting thing too is about historiography. One of the weaknesses of historiography in terms of immigration studies is that the vast majority of work is done by Irish migrants or the sons or daughters of Irish about the Irish. What we desperately need is somebody who isn't Irish to start to study the Irish in the locations. So, but thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Yeah, one question for Patty. One interesting aspect of the whole history of both Basque and Irish immigrants, let's say to the western states of the U.S., is the portrayal of the sheep herder. So both Irish, Scots, and Basque were portrayed as sheep herders, whereas British, English, I should say, English were more cattle owners. And as you were very well known, there were like wars between sheep herders and cattle owners. There are several Hollywood movies like the 1950 Montana with starring Errol Flynn that portray that. So my question would be, how in your research, how or in which instances did Irish and Basque immigrants to the U.S. cooperate, let's say in like sheep herding, or in how did they cooperate, or how did they meld together? Because they did share some common ground. Thank you.
It's a good question, which only reveals a lacuna of my real research in that area, but it's a good research question. And again, I think that one of the interesting institutions that struck me in my quick potted course, Introduction to Reading in Basque migration, was this institution of the boarding house, which struck me as a really interesting example of a zone for integration, and that it wasn't catering exclusively for Basques. It was a mediation space, and in that space, I feel certain that Irish or Scottish, there would have been a lot of interaction, and it's a way of sort of saying what were the Basques in the boarding house projecting as their dynamic emerging identity in the new world. So I think it'd be a very, very interesting place. The other interesting point is just to say that a lot of the evidence suggests that the most rapid integration on behalf of Irish Catholic migrants to America is in the urban frontier of the emerging urban area of the West. If that applied to Irish Catholics, the other question is, did that also apply for Catholics from the Basque Country? In other words, was it a freer kind of environment for people to make more rapid upward social progress?
Yes. So I had a question or a commentary question on the issue raised for the the chair raised on the notion of trauma, and your answer. Professor Palacios, I don't, that's your name, okay. And I'm wondering, because you presented a wide interdisciplinary, let's say, series of methodologies. With the about the trauma studies, I'm asking if you use the concept of Marianne Hirst of post-memory. I mean, you mentioned two trauma studies and on, but I mean, to what I have seen so far, I mean, from Holocaust studies to analysis of biographical interviews based on trauma. Yeah, this concept of post-memory by Marianne Hirst is widely used, and I was just wondering if you had sort of used or reworked aspects of that concept in your methodology. Thanks.
Yes, the critics that have been more useful for my analysis have been the ones that I mentioned. That was Suzette Henke and Laura S. Brown, those daily traumas, because we don't normally think of them as traumas anymore, but those are the ones that women very often have to suffer and deal with. And of course, then also the warning or somehow the encouragement by Geoffrey Hartman to identify those psychic wounds in discourse. Those are my the ones that I have found most useful. But of course, there are other references that I have looked up and I still need to look up, and I have yours in the bibliography, but I cannot think of a notion that I found relevant, particularly for the texts that I was analyzing. But I will go into that again, and I thank you for the recommendation.
A comment on, or a question also on trauma, right? I think that trauma plays a role in narratology of migrations in a particular way, right? On the one hand, immigrants want to emphasize their success and their triumphs, right? But in the narrative of triumphs, you have to start with suffering, right? There is no triumph even in religious narratology, right? So you need some suffering at the beginning, and then you overcome that and eventually triumph, right? And the other thing that trauma plays a role is like a rationalization for the decisions to live, right? After all, we always think of the poor and the helpless that are migrating. That's not true, actually. Most of the people who migrate are younger, healthier, more successful, more vigorous, and often more with more resources than those who they leave behind. Particularly before, we idealize ambition and as a virtue rather than a sin, right? Individual ambition, and there is always that feeling that some of the narratives of trauma is a way for them to say, no, we didn't leave the weaker, the most vulnerable, our parents, the elderly behind, and just left for our own desires and improvement, right, and ambitions, but like a rationalization, right, of a behavior that is not that is selfish, but it's self-centered. They were not thinking about the weaker ones that they left behind, particularly if they stop sending remittances, and they usually do. And in terms of, Patrick, what you said about the Catholics in the rural frontier, here you too should collaborate, because in the frontier, the only two Catholic groups for most of the 19th century were Catholic Irish and Catholic Germans, right? I mean, in the case of Germans, most were Lutherans, but there was a big, significant Irish Catholic minority, I don't know, 40%, 35%. So it is very common in urban centers that the first transnational interfaith marriages were Catholic Germans and Catholic Irish. So it will be interesting to know what is happening in the West and the...
Yes, thank you very much for that very interesting observation. I think that somehow connects with Professor Devoto's a reference to the delayed trauma as well, because in our research, it was the writers that wrote about female migrant experiences. So the ones that seem to be traumatized were the writers themselves. So you see, it's like inherited trauma somehow as well. But would you say is extremely relevant to the analysis of guilt? And so I thank you for that observation, and I will go on exploring that, because there's a lot of guilt on the part of those who leave and those who stay in different ways. For instance, one of the writers, Galician writers now living in Madrid, Luz Pichel, has the mother saying in a register that confuses Spanish and Galician. She left for Venezuela in the 1950s. She says to the daughter when she's dying, "I should have never left you." So that there's all the expression of guilt there as well, which is very interesting to explore, and which we identify as one of those psychic wounds as well. So thank you very much for that.
Women assimilate or integrate much more easier than male migrants, right? That they complain less, that they feel more at ease in the new society, in the new environment, that they're more adaptable. One study after the other. So it is very interesting that men are writing about the trauma of the women who are the less traumatic.
I also I want to say this. Trauma. This is a psychoanalytic concept that is used a metaphor for all use, and we must distinguish one and another's, I think. One is at a level conscious. The other is an unconscious level. Then, if not, we speak about different thing under the same name, trauma. Okay, that's, sorry, but.
Maybe there should be another label, which is stories of suffering.
Okay.
A very well-known book, which seems germane, David Fitzpatrick's wonderful study of Irish-Australian correspondence, which he entitled Oceans of Consolation, which sets out the argument that the role of the letters was to a significant extent about healing wounds of departure and keeping families connected over very long distances between Australasia and Ireland. Your point on marriage is well made and a good one. My observation from reading too many Irish-American immigrant letters is that sons and daughters in the United States in the 1880s and the 1890s wanted desperately to write home to tell parents that they had married somebody from within about a 20-mile radius. So it's not to say that there weren't German-Irish marriages, there were, but by and large, I think there's a very strong desire for young men and young women from a particular place in Ireland to let their parents know they've married somebody who they can mentally map from their locale in Ireland. They take great pride and joy in passing on the news that they've forged a relationship in California that has its origins back in Ireland. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah. Coffee time.
Well, thank you very much.